October 19th, 1906. Today was my first day of work with Mr. Soper. It was disorienting for me to rise with the church bells and get ready for work instead of preparing for school. I felt confused. I didn't know what was appropriate dress for my first ride in a motor carriage, as my wardrobe consists mainly of my simple black school skirts and my white shirtwaists and jackets. Would I need something more professional, like a suit? I didn't know what an assistant was supposed to look or act like. I wasn't sure I would be able to meet my chief's expectations. Mrs. Browning's doubts sounded in my head, but I put on my good maroon outfit and a matching cape and hat, and I made myself walk the whole mile to work, as walking always calms me. I met Mr. Soper at the office, where he waited outside in the crisp morning air with Mr. Thompson, our round, balding client. They both leaned on one of those Stanley steamers I've seen advertised in the billboards near Tin Pan Alley. When Mr. Soper saw me, he nodded to Mr. Thompson, who went to the front of the motor carriage, opened the hood, and began to do something with the engine. I had never been so close to an actual locomobile. They're always passing so rapidly on the streets and seem so unstable, as if they might explode any second. This one was green, with white spoked wheels and the black top and neatly folded down. It shone so brightly I felt myself drawn to touch the vehicle. The coach came to life, and with a spit and a roar, and I jumped back, feeling as if a friendly dog had suddenly barked at me. Vapor emanated from the hood, and for a moment I didn't want to go in, but Mr. Soper reached out a hand and assisted me into the back. The expanse of padded leather seating was so comfortable as a sofa. Once the auto was running smoothly, Mr. Thompson wiped his bare head with his hand and on his kerchief and entered behind the wheel beside Mr. Soper. We began to drive. Everything seemed so close, riding without a top, the snorts of horses that loomed overhead, the loud explosion of gasoline carriages, the bells and the clanging trolley, and the shouts of the pedestrians into whom Mr. Thompson nearly crashed several times. We flew past everything so quickly that my head spun. I clutched the side of the carriage, trying to steady myself, and held on to my hat, afraid of what I'd gotten myself into. Mr. Soper broke off in audible shouts to our client and turned to glance at me every now and then. I think to make sure I hadn't been hit by flying debris. I'm ashamed to say, but I secretly prayed to be back in school, sitting beside Josephine, looking out the window at the smokestacks and thinking my own quiet thoughts. It wasn't until we crossed the grand, jammed Brooklyn Bridge and drove up through Queens and out onto the more rural lands that I began to enjoy the ride and to feel the wind on my face. I had never had any reason to visit the New York countryside, and the vision of cows munching hay in the fields and the fresh smell of the reddening autumn leaves soothed me. Mr. Soper is a very serious man, with hardly a moment to explain things to me. At Oyster Bay, on Long Island, we pulled up to a stone mansion surrounded by some exotic flowers drying in their pods, the ripening apple trees overlooking the water. The country seemed so serene. Mr. Soper got out with Mr. Thompson. They'd been discussing how typhoid could be carried in food, and Mr. Soper wanted to see the kitchen first. I followed them around back. The kitchen was bigger than our entire apartment. The light poured in through 4 windows that bounced off the shiny bottoms of the dozens of copper pots that hung in the wide brick chimney. I felt myself shifting from foot to foot, distracted by the size of the blackness of the stove and the look of the real icebox, the chopping block as long as my bed. "Pay attention, Miss Galuski, and write this information in the folio," Mr. Soper barked at me. "Think of what Mr. Thompson is saying." I quickly opened the folio and gripped my pencil. It was hard to pay attention with so much to look at, but I kept my eyes down on the paper, feeling a blush crawl up my neck. "This is our situation here," he said. "Mr. Thompson's family and servants became ill. September 4th. Write that down. Specific notes. His son fevered at 10 o'clock. On that Thursday evening after eating apples and cheese. The laundress got sick that Sunday at 7 in the morning. After breakfasting on pancakes. Stay alert and keep your hand moving. This is your job," he said. He had heard things I had missed completely. I wrote as quickly as I could, trying to keep my mind on my work. Mr. Soper began to question Mrs. Thompson, who came into the pantry. Shelves and shelves filled with cookies and breads and honey and jarred jams, all the food one could ever want. I stood behind him, feeling a bit unsteady, my mouth dry, my stomach empty. Plump Mrs. Thompson, thick yellow hair hung loose on its bun, her skin a rashy pink. Clearly, she had been barely recovered from the fever, but Mr. Soper questioned her thoroughly just the same. Her voice wavered as she described how she'd begun feeling sick on Friday at about 11 p.m. in mid-September, the 12th, the same day as her daughter Amy. After her dinner guests, the McDonald, Graff, and Chadwell couples, no children, had departed. Menu: broiled sole with asparagus tips, caviar, chocolate mousse, French bread, butter from a neighboring farm. Mr. Soper asked her about the visitors, if any of them had fallen ill, or could have brought the disease into the house. She shook her head. Her doctors had spoken to their acquaintances, the three couples plus the Lyons family, Mr. Sarasano, and the neighbors, the Haytons, and their 5 boys. As far as they knew, her friends had neither brought nor contracted the typhoid. As she spoke, Mr. Soper made sure I wrote names, foods, times, dates. We will follow these like breadcrumbs through the forest, he says. Mrs. Thompson then showed us in the dining room where most of the family meals took place, and after she walked through the house. I followed her and Mr. Soper through the bedrooms and the bathrooms, feeling odd about being in the wealthy family's home, their life so different from mine, their privacy completely revealed to us. I had to keep reminding myself that they had been struck by a terrible disease, and I was there to help find out why. In the afternoon, we talked briefly to the eldest son, Jimmy, a boy my age, blond like his mother, long-limbed, easy with himself. He had fully healed from his sickness, though I noted the prominence of his collarbones and the greenish tinge under his cheerful blue eyes. He had gone clamming in the bay with his brothers, Ronnie and Billy, all summer. They had played polo at the neighbors to the right, the Haytons. The 3 boys had come down with the illness on the same day, September 4th. Mr. Soper asked him to remember when exactly it struck him, and the boys said that it was in the early morning, sometime before the mailman arrived at 9. Not a Friday, like Mrs. Thompson. In fact, their illness came more than a week before Mrs. Thompson's. We left the house after our interview with the boy. Mr. Thompson and Mr. Soper didn't speak on the ride back. At the office at the end of the day, Mr. Soper nodded to me and said, "There is depth to this case, and we're not yet reaching. We will return to Oyster Bay tomorrow. We will have a good deal of work ahead of us." All day I felt as if things were going on somewhere above me, while I tried to climb high enough to see, to understand. Follow the food, Mr. Soper says. Follow the movements of the family. But I feel like I don't know what we're looking for. I don't even know how we'll know when we've found it.